Okay. So, um, so the Crossroads. So there are sort of a bunch of different places. Now, also the cross in related to Christianity is very often used as this depiction of being pulled between the opposites, right? The reconciliation of the opposites. And as I've already sort of talked about, there is a sanitized and relatively abstract idea of the reconciliation of the opposites that we sometimes encounter, right? It's this idea that you're going to get some kind of beautiful, smooth meshing, and from it, right, from through the transcendent function will emerge this wonderful new thing, which is great, except that in principle, that's true, and may in fact be the end goal of such a reconciliation of opposites, right? But in practice, reconciling opposites tends to be a considerably more fraught and a violent kind of thing. You're dealing with opposites. So, look no further than, combining together baking soda and vinegar in one of those science fair volcanoes to give some sense of what it is like when you combine opposites, right? Or those of you who track physics more, like think about combining matter and antimatter. It's explosive. Or even just combining something very hot and very cold. If you've ever had like a glass vessel that was quite cold that you poured hot water into shatter, right? Because it was heated up too quickly. Like the stress of combining those opposites can produce this tremendous amount of force. When we consider that idea psychologically, right? You can imagine all of these different polarized traits, and very often it is the case, right, that as we are attempting to develop functions, psychological functions, we are first pulling them apart, right? Solve. At coagula. So we're pulling them apart first and getting this, differentiated thing where they exist in themselves. But then very often it's the case that one of them is sort of dominant in the psyche, the other is dominant in the psyche. But eventually, in order to affect the integration, you want to have them co-occurring in the psyche. And when you do that, right, you're going to tend to have this extremely violent clash. Now, I'll say, sort of speaking personally on this, I've mentioned before that the last handful of years have represented for me something of a reconciliation of opposites in this respect, which is to say that, my 20s had a very particular character to them within my life. They were very much focused away from kind of conventional career. After a certain point, I had done a stint, entrepreneurially, but then I was very concerned with sort of creative and spiritual endeavors. I was less concerned with worldly markers. And at a certain point towards the end of my 20s, that started to come to a head as I realized, like, oh no, like, time. I really need to get to the world. And so in many ways, there was a transition in my late 20s, right, into my 30s, and it sort of stuck in my 30s, where I decided to be more deliberately worldly. This coincided, as I have mentioned before, with a sort of active attempt to try to cultivate and connect to some of the aspects of masculinity as I had seen them expressed in my father. And my father is very ambitious. He's quite bright. He's fairly worldly in a lot of ways. Although he never put it on his car, he had a bumper sticker that said, "He who has the most toys when he dies wins," which is an idea that I find, a bit. I'm a bit skeptical of, let's just say, because it's like he who has the most toys when he dies is dead. But substitute toys for something else. Books, role-playing games, you name it. And of course, this is an idea that you also see relatively commonly expressed in other ways. If you substitute toys with experiences, then you get something, right? He who has the most experiences when he dies wins. This is something that, obviously is part and parcel of sort of every bucket list things. And I find bucket lists a bit off-putting too. But anyway, be that as it may. After my 20s, right, where I had this premature conjunctio experience, where I had sort of tried to separate myself out in some important sense from that energy and prematurely attempted to integrate femininity, and I had had these various sort of unpleasant experiences and unconscious eruptions around this, I decided that I needed, essentially speaking, to develop those aspects of my personality before I integrated them, that I had been running away from that worldliness in a certain way. And so, I came back to the world. This is when, I decided to sort of focus on career and focus on, whatever finances, shoring up my finances, and focus on, a certain kinds of achievement, external achievement, right? I had been very focused on a kind of internal model of this, a very intrinsic motivation, a very autotelic, a very play-based, right, sort of thing. But instead, I was focusing on a more outwardly ambitious sort of thing. And there's no question that that approach, when I leaned into it, bore substantial fruit. I started working more. I became involved in a lot of projects. I became involved with the university. I did a lot, relatively speaking, in the world. And then, as I started to come towards the end of my 30s, I became increasingly aware that something was coming. This is what I would tell everybody. It's like something is coming. Like I can feel it. Something is coming. Something is coming. And I had, even then, this intimation that what was coming was this integration. That what was, what I was looking at was maybe finally being in a position, right, where I had developed this other side of things through my 20s, and then I had sort of, not retired it, but let it go, a bit fallow. And instead, I had focused on this other aspect of myself. And it was time to sort of combine these things. I very much felt that I was starting to sort of reach the energetic limits in some ways of what was possible, given my state. I was, burning the candle at both ends and the middle, so I was expending a lot of energy. I was involved in a lot of projects. This was beginning to add up. I am now squarely, I suppose, middle-aged. I am middle-aged. And the recognition that I was kind of coming towards that also meant that the sort of energetic reservoir that I had drawn on to get things done for a long time was not what it had once been, right? Once upon a time, when I was 19, not quite 19, 18, 19, I once stayed awake for 5 days straight to work on a business project. 5 days straight. Not that I recommend this, so it was an interesting experience. And staying awake in this way, right? Having a kind of seemingly limitless reservoir of energy that, was not always comfortable, but it was a choice I could make. Well, increasingly, as I have grown older, this is not a choice I can make, right? Pulling an all-nighter is almost impossible for me now, right? Almost impossible. I can do it under duress, but, and God bless, there are people I know that can't do it. I deal with sleep deprivation relatively well. But the point is, it had really begun to dawn on me that this was no way to run a railroad. It was no way to live, right? Constantly being in this kind of energetically strung state. And I was starting to see some somatic things, right? So I had some anxiety, and I was having, some sort of physical fallout from that, and so on and so forth. So I had this idea that I needed to ease that energy down. I had really jammed my foot to the floor on the pedal to sort of accelerate, to catch up, right? To catch up against some obviously persona-driven external idea of where one is supposed to be, equity, relationship, what have you. So I'd really jammed my foot to the floor to try to catch up, I would say reasonably effectively, and got my career up to a place where suddenly it was beginning to open up in ways that I didn't anticipate. And so I've spoken about this too. Virtually every year that I've taught, I've had some number of students approach me and say, something along the lines of, I really like what you're doing. How do I do it? To which my answer is I don't know. I don't quite know how I got here. There was a lot of hard work involved, yes, but not all of that hard work seems causally connected exactly to what has happened. A lot of things have sort of feels as though I've fallen backwards into them. And it's not that I'm ungrateful. It's just that my gratitude is expressed to a great extent in terms of sort of good fortune. I've had a tremendous amount of good fortune, leaving aside the questions of privilege, which obviously are a thing. I recognize that. But in addition to that, the degree of good fortune that I've had didn't seem fully, it didn't seem to be fully captured in those terms either. So there was a kind of integration that was already beginning to occur, this kind of fruiting that had begun to occur, and I began to see glimpses of, a different way, right? A different way for me, a different way of being, one that was possibly going to allow me to reincorporate some of these aspects that I had sidelined over the course of my 30s that had really dominated my 20s back into my life. Now, I wouldn't say that the aspects of my 20s were exactly shoved into my shadow. I never quite, disavowed them or anything, but they were considerably less dominant. And the traits that became dominant, these sort of worldly traits, really took on a momentum of their own. I was busy. I remain busy, but I was busy all the time, schedule like a brick wall. Now that was true in my 20s too, but it was sort of differently true, right? I was scheduled all the time, but very often it was social. I would have 4 social events a day, constantly trying to catch up with, sort of not having to declare social bankruptcy as I, would come to the city and interact with people sort of rapid fire, so that I was making sure I had some upkeep in my relationships. So I was very busy in that sense, and I was often attending to people in my 20s, because even before I was a therapist, that was an intense concern for me, when people I know are in a state of suffering, and often, in fact, when people I don't know that well even are in a state of suffering, it's not uncommon for them to sort of, whatever, come to me, but also for me to be attracted to that state and want to work with them, something that very obviously, right, manifested itself in my choices of career. But the point was, I could feel this integration coming. I could feel it coming. And I've mentioned this repeatedly, but my actual experience over the last few years of that integration has been extremely difficult. It's been chaotic. It's not been this smooth thing. It hasn't been just the two things meshing together and yielding a kind of, superpowered state where I would get to be creative all the time, but also somehow I would, have a healthy salary. Like, it just wasn't like that. It turned out that trying to get those things meshing was, as I often have said, like hot lava, hot fresh lava pouring directly into ice cold seawater, kind of an explosive, right? And that's something that I've grappled with quite a bit for the last few years. I've had to do a lot of negotiating. So interestingly, recently I was at a Crossroads myself, which is why I bring this up. Every couple of years, the last 2 years, I have had this intimation really hit me. This, like, I need to slow down. Like, I have to sort of clear space out of this brick wall of scheduling if I'm going to fit in this new mode of being. I have to give it room to breathe, right? I have to pry up some of the paving stones to give the soil some air if I'm going to cultivate this new way of being for myself, if I'm going to give the space for it to really flourish. And I have not been entirely successful in doing so. Although every couple of years I've sort of backed off, often at a crisis point, right, where I'm like, I can't keep doing this. I can't keep operating at this level. There's complexes at work, and those complexes have exerted this kind of magnetic force where seemingly, right, behind the scenes of what my actual intention has been, there's this organizing principle that refills my schedule. Now, I've become very aware at some level of what the aspects of that are, and a lot of it has to do with the very frontline way in which I perceive potential. So my sense of potential is much stronger than my sense of... Whoa! I nudged the camera. Can't do that. Okay. My sense of potential is much stronger, right, than my sense of actuality in some important sense. That's very useful. It means that I can sort of sense the potentials of things in the world and sense the potentials of things in people, right? That's a useful kind of skill to have. It's useful entrepreneurially, and it's useful therapeutically, and it's useful in doing this kind of archetypal work, right? I can sort of sense the potential. But the problem with that, as often as not, for me, is that my sense of those potentials renders potentials intensely exciting, but it does not always reasonably code for me in terms of what the actual time demands and energy demands of something are going to be. So when I'm in that potential space, my ability to pick up limitation is poor. And I will tend to somewhat excitedly be like, yes, I can. Yes, I can. Yes, I can. And of course, then I get myself up to a place where, yes, it's all theoretically possible, but practically speaking, it's drawing down my energy reserves in a way that just simply isn't tenable, right? That isn't tenable. So, so in working through this over the last bunch of years, I, have gone through this repeated pattern. I've sort of, hit something of a crisis. I've tried to clear my schedule out. I've caught a big breath of fresh air, and I've said to myself and my friends and my partner, I've said, like, okay, that's it. I'm clearing it out. I'm not going to do that again. But then, like it starts to reaccumulate, and I found myself in the same place. A very clear sign of a complex I had. If you keep finding yourself in the same place, same situation. So I was coming up on one of these again, and I, was sort of boiling my way through it last summer, amid lockdown, and lockdown gave this kind of spaciousness to contemplation. There was like a momentary breather, right, when everything went into lockdown, and then all of a sudden it was like back up to speed, right? Teaching, therapy, projects, my creative work, just kind of going. And so it had really started to boil again because I was like, damn it, like I'm here again. What am I doing? Like, or how can I come at this? How can I not just sort of smash the schedule, but get to this underlying thing? And I've had some encounters with the sort of complex in question. It turned out to be sort of the dark side of my Superman complex, where the Superman complex, of course, steps in and says, like, I can do it, and if I can do it, I must do it, because someone has to do it, right? And, the Superman complex has a lot of beneficial things to it. There's something to be said in certain circumstances for being overconfident, right? There are things that we'd never attempt unless we were overconfident. And indeed, that overconfidence sometimes sort of pays off. You try things, and I'm a great trier of things. I like jumping in on things. I even like jumping in on things, frankly, if I'm not entirely prepared. I enjoy the challenge, right? It's scary, but also I enjoy jumping in on things. I enjoy engaging in circumstances where, by any technical dint, I am not, I'm not qualified at some level, right? Something that a number of my friends and colleagues have noted, this, like, just try it. So the Superman complex is very useful in that respect. And of course, it cares deeply for people, and it's ambitious and so on and so forth. But the flip side was, a couple of years ago when I had one of these, I tried to sort of pull back from that. And I had the Superman complex come in force and basically say, like, no, you have to do it. And I've talked about this before, right? You have to do it. And I'm like, why do I have to do it? It's like, because you said you would. And to which my response was, well, yeah, but I made a mistake. And I say response, I was literally talking to it out loud. Yeah, I made a mistake. And it's like, you're not allowed. And I'm like, I'm not allowed to make a mistake? And it was like, no. And my response was, but making mistakes is human. Like, I'm overcommitted. That was a mistake. But I made a mistake, and I want to rectify it. And in this particular case, a couple of years ago, I indeed had rectified something in a miraculously low fallout way. I had figured a workaround that, reduced my stress and improved several other people's situations. It was kind of a perfect situation. And yet this thing was still reacting in this way. Like, you can't, because you said you'd do it. And I was like, but making errors is human. And it was like, oh yes, absolutely. To err is human. And when I put those two things together, I suddenly realized what the dark side of the Superman complex was, right? Was that, yeah, to err is human, but not for you. You're not human. And that inability of it to grasp human limitation, right? That inability of it to grasp the shift from the merely sort of potential and airborne to the concrete and limited was really at the crux of things. It just didn't see that, or wouldn't apply it to me. So I was very aware of this. So what were the crossroads? I shouldn't get into it too much because it's sort of not gelled, but let's just say that, since last summer I had been thinking about how I was going to open space, how I was going to reduce things, how I was going to open space. And I was very concerned with opening space for my own intellectual endeavors, which haven't had the attention that I would like to give it to them. I've been involved in so many administrative tasks, not-for-profits and startups and research, right? That is not primarily my own. So I've been involved in all these other things, and I really wanted to clear space for that. I wanted to clear space for my creativity. I had carved out a small, persistent space for my creativity with regard to sort of role-playing, which is an absolute lifeline for me, and to which I put a huge amount of effort. My efforts in those spaces are sort of my primary artistic outlet, and I take it very seriously. I take the art of role-playing seriously, but I also take my preparation seriously. And my players get to be the very small audience beneficiary for often sort of outsized expenditures, sometimes of money, but often just of effort. I've gotten very into sort of making these big set pieces and things, these wow set pieces. I had managed to continue to carve out that space and continue to carve out space to write a 3-day novel, but I was like, I want something that is more open. Not the all the time creative space that was my 20s, but something that where I do have that space. And of course, being a therapist actually is one of the jobs that allows for this sort of thing. It was one of the appeals of it when I went into it. And I'm friends with a bunch of analysts, and of course, they, by and large, don't retire. They just take fewer clients, right? They get older, they take fewer clients. They have less money coming in, but they're still doing it because it's mobile, interesting work. And, right, they've been working possibly with people for a long time, and it's really fascinating, engaging work. But if you just take, 20 hours of clients a week, you can make a pretty healthy income. Even making space for sliding scale and so on and so forth, you can still make a pretty healthy income, and it leaves you with a lot of time, hypothetically. And it's flexible, right? You can sort of choose when you're going to work, so it leaves you with a lot of time. And this came to have a tremendous appeal, right? I was having fantasies around sort of moving out of the city, right? Like purchasing property outside the city where houses don't cost $1 million, and having, a workshop. I had a workshop here in the city and it got taken away. I have a small one in my place here, but, this sort of opening. So I'd been thinking about this in terms of reduction. And finally, sort of in the lead up to Christmas, I approached a lot of the people that I was involved in projects with and said, hey, look, I have to do this. Like, I need to reduce my commitments. And I'm, in many cases, not feeling connected, right, to the project in this way anymore. We need to transition. We need to look for people who are going to take over those roles that I'm playing because I need to get some of this back. And it sat a little strangely with me, and the balance of it was quite tricky. I wasn't totally sure, like, how much of my energy, sort of therapy was kind of a given, but I was like, okay, how much of my energy is in therapy? How much of my energy is in teaching? How much of my energy is in side projects? And depending on where I was at any given day, I was swinging around in this space quite a bit. There were definitely times when it sort of, hit me, this idea that I could radically reduce, and if I did, the shape of my life would be very, very different. So I had decided I'm going to quite radically reduce. Not give up teaching, continue to teaching, but maybe at a considerably lesser scale. And then, basically, right when I had made the decision, and I had really been grappling with it, I got an offer from the university, which was going to involve more teaching. Now, it was a good offer, but also it represented a step in exactly the direction that I had been sort of moving away from, and yet from the position of kind of ambition, career, what are the opportunities here, right? And needless to say, this, of course, had just a tremendously activating effect for me. Tremendously activating effect. And it was very much a kind of crossroads moment. Very much a kind of crossroads moment where I was like, okay, I'm making a choice here. And I had been thinking I would pick one road, but now all of a sudden, what's happened? I have fallen backwards, and now there is this opportunity coming up. And if I take this, this is going to be a certain kind of shape. And I wrestled with it. Oh, we're up to 25 minutes again. Okay, so let me pause, and then I'll keep going.